Thank you for everybody for calling in, and especially important to say how important it is that we have these dialogue, and this is where society and the conversations that we have within society, this is where the healing really begins and continues. So I appreciate the opportunity, and I am a big fan of AMI-Quebec. We are dealing with addiction at Chabad Lifeline. It's a drop-in center. We have 8 clinicians, and we deal with about 16,000 visits a year, dealing with family members with addiction, and that's where we have such a common ground. And I refer people all the time to AMI-Quebec because of the work they're doing, the outstanding work they do with family members of people with mental illness. So we have a family program, family members of people with addiction. We also have a youth department. We also have a process addiction department, which I'm going to talk a little bit about. And we're doing a lot of stuff with the youth in schools, as well as working with the addict one-on-one. And what seems to work with our population, and I think in general, with mental illness as well as addiction, is a lot of the group dynamic work. Addiction has been called a disorder of the disconnect. And I think that disconnect is not just for addiction, not just for mental illness. I think in general, it's something that an awful lot of people share their struggle when it comes to connecting with others. Where so much of the work is being directed now is how can we better connect with ourselves, with others, with a higher power, however you want to define that higher power. And it's that disconnect, the dis-ease that is what people are struggling with. So let's get right to the topic at hand, which is the commonality between addiction and mental illness. They call it dual diagnosis. Dual meaning there's two, and the diagnosis could be either or both, actually. It's going to mean both mental illness and addiction. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the commonality, a little bit about different symptoms, and I'm really open to your questions. But before I even do any of that, I want to tell you that today, as a matter of fact, every Tuesday at noon at Chabad Lifeline, which is right by the Jewish General Hospital here in Montreal, we have an open meeting. It's an open speakers meeting. And every week we invite somebody who's gone through our program. It's an outpatient treatment center. Somebody who has gone through the program, through our treatment, and is in a much better place today than they were. And they share their own experience in about a half hour. They share their experience, their strength, their hope, where they were before, where they are now, and how they got here. And in the room are anybody that wants to show up. And I invite many times people from community, mental health care workers, and what then becomes a very intimate setting where a person's leading with their weakness, and vulnerability becomes sought after. It's interesting when you create that dynamic in a room, how wonderful the sharing can be. And so just today, Tuesday noon meeting, we had somebody share about her experience growing up with actually a grandmother who was schizophrenic, a mother who was a out-of-control alcoholic, drug addict, and this person was sharing about her own struggle with addiction and mental illness. And then we had about 30 people in the room, and I would say about 70% of the people who were sharing in the room were talking also about their families, whether mental illness and addiction. And one thing that came out time and again was the importance of speaking to the family and naming what's going on, being able to be open as best you can. And another thing that came out was this girl was talking about how her mother was always saying, "Come to me and speak to me," but every time she would come and speak to her mother would visibly be overwhelmed with anxiety from the daughter's plight, and which basically gave the message to her daughter that she really can't speak to her mother because it's too hard for her mother to deal with. So what she was saying was how important it is to have a dialogue and to be able, best you can, to be able to be there for each other without sort of putting your stuff in the way, which is it's no small thing, and it takes a lot of work. But this is just some of the reflections that I'm hearing on a regular basis. I want to pass that on. Okay, so let's talk about dual diagnosis. 43.6 million American adults were reported to have some type of mental illness. This is a 2014 study. And approximately 20 million adults struggle with substance abuse. Within those groups, almost 8 million people face a co-occurring mental illness and substance disorder. So 8 million people are reporting dual diagnosis. And that's not a real number because what I said before is we have a program that deals with process addictions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means, and then we're going to see how these statistics are really not telling the whole story. It's much bigger than 8 million people facing co-current mental illness out of the 43 million Americans who reported mental illness. So we know what substance abuse is. It's what it is, substance of any abuse or addiction when it comes to intake of something outside of you. That's a substance, alcohol, drugs, certainly prescription drugs are on the rise, and painkillers, of course, alcohol. This is substance abuse. And so it's illicit drugs, cocaine, heroin, crack, marijuana, which is a topic on its own that I'm going to speak a little bit about, marijuana and induced psychosis that we see in young people more often than not nowadays. But besides, okay, so that's substances, right? We got it, drugs, alcohol, clear. And everyone knows about those addictions. Cigarettes, certainly part of that. Coffee, you can even put in there. Sugar, for sure. But then there's also process addictions or behavioral addictions. So that would be things like the ones most commonly understood are gambling. Then there's something less understood, but we've come a long way with it. It's sex addiction, which is a very important point to bring out. Sex. We have at Chabad Lifeline a certified sex addiction therapist, only one in Quebec. New York, actually throughout the States, more and more people are getting this certification. In Toronto as well. Quebec somehow is behind with this. It's not sex therapy. It's dealing with the addiction. So when sexual behavior, sexual thinking, obsessive-compulsive behaviors become addictive. So we see the brain reacting the same way it would with drugs or alcohol. You get the same type of reactions with gambling, sex addiction, co-dependency, which is another subject altogether, eating disorders. So the brain is then, in a certain sense, doesn't necessarily know the difference between the substance that's coming from outside and the messages the brain's getting from the interaction with the behavior. The brain is getting lit up, and it depends on the person, depends on the situation, but it's not about what is getting a person high. It's just the fact that, so when we look at these statistics and they talk about substance abuse, they say 20 million people struggle with substance abuse in the past year. That's substance abuse. Now we want to enter into that conversation all the different process addictions. It's an awful lot more than 20 million people. I don't know if you can double it, maybe, but then you can also look at the number of people facing concurrent mental illness and substance disorders, and if it was 8 million before, we can definitely add a whole bunch of numbers on top of that of people who are suffering from dual diagnosis if you include this process addictions. Let's talk a little bit about symptoms. How does a person know? Well, you know what? There's screening tools, and I think that's actually one of the most important things I can leave you with, is that we have an extensive screening process. So when someone comes to our place their intake will include screenings and asking questions that other places are, I've been told actually by other places, that they're afraid to ask certain questions because they don't know what to do with the answers. So, for instance, we train at university counseling centers, and we were at a university speaking to the counselors, and we asked them, do you speak about a person's eating? Do you speak about their use of the internet? Do you speak about gambling? And do you speak about their relationships, their relationship with internet or with gambling or relationship with food, which, by the way, the relationship is really what determines the addiction. So it's how much of, how close is the relationship a person has with these behaviors. So I know many times people have said that cocaine was their only love. They placed cocaine above their children. So that shows how the relationship is just so all-consuming. So when we went to these counseling centers and training the counselors, we would bring up things like that. They would say, well, we wouldn't want to ask that because if someone came back and said they were on the internet using pornography for X amount of time, and they wouldn't know what to do with the client. So the screenings are so important. So much of the time, people are not being diagnosed properly because at the onset, they're not going through a proper screening. So screening has to be a thorough one, including all of the person's behaviors, and that's both for mental illness and for addiction. But let's talk about some of the symptoms that we look for when it comes to screening for abuse. So one is going to be withdrawal from friends and family. Basically, things change. When there is an addiction that starts to take over a person, that person's life will have changes, of course. And one of them will be a change. There will be a withdrawal from friends and family. It's almost the opposite of what you might expect. I was speaking today to a guidance counselor at one of the high schools here, and she was telling me that a kid came to her who was caught with marijuana and said, but this is how we socialize. Sitting and smoking pot is what brings us together. So there you would think it's the opposite of withdrawing, but in fact, if 10 people are going to be using alcohol or drugs or marijuana, 1 in 10 is that it will be an addict. So 10% of that crowd are, even though they're socializing with the drug, or and the others are using the drug as a way to socialize, there's going to be the addict in the crowd who is actually isolating in the crowd, and that will spill over. The isolation, by the way, becomes what it's unbearable. Isolation in general for the human condition is usually unbearable, and that's what brings a person to try to use again to free himself from that isolation, and that's what the drug abuse or the behavioral addictions do. They continuously offer hope getting out of isolation, and it's an illusion. It actually encourages and brings up more withdrawal from friends and family. So there's also going to be sudden changes in behavior. If a kid comes to home and all of a sudden he's changed, his behavior has changed radically, suddenly. Something's going on over there. This is also, by the way, these symptoms we can use not just for addiction but for mental illness. And then using substances under dangerous conditions. So many people will use different forms of, they will abuse different things. But most people, somewhere around 90% of the people, once consequences start to affect them, they will give up what's causing the consequences. Not when it comes to addiction. That's one of the ways we know. How is it affecting your life? And even though it's affecting your life, are you still continuing? So there's a big question. So why are you still continuing? Usually a person's going to be involved in self-sabotaging, self-destructive behaviors. There's an underlying cause. And what we believe as far as the addiction model is there's an element of powerlessness. that a person cannot get out of that once they're in that on their own. They'll be engaging in risky behaviors. Risky behaviors, in a certain sense, become something that a person can get high from. Just the risk alone becomes exhilarating, and it changes the brain chemistry, and that whole thing could become addictive. So someone who is also a drug addict, for instance, will go to great lengths, go to any length to continue their using, and that could involve risky behaviors. And there's also loss of control over use of substances. Any loss of control in general shows on a potential addiction. And loss of control, like I said before, has to do with unmanageability of a person's life, and finding themselves in situations time and again. They have no idea how they got there, but they're there again, and they're never going to be there again, and then they find themselves there again, over and over again. So that's loss of control. And developing a high tolerance and withdrawal for these different drugs. The more you use, the more you need. The harder it is to stop. That becomes a cycle when it comes to addiction. And feeling like you need a drug to be able to function. Let's be clear. No one, well, I shouldn't say no one, but in general, people do not do things that hurt them because they want consciously to hurt themselves. Most people are simply trying to survive, and they'll find any way necessary. And the brain is very simple in that sense. If the brain finds things that's going to give relief for a feeling of anxiety, for a feeling of isolation, for a feeling of shame, any type of unbearable feelings, if the brain experiences a relief, it's going to keep on going back to that relief. And if a person is predispositioned to addiction, or then that's a real trap that the brain is going to fall into. Let's talk a little bit about the ways to identify. Let's go back a second. Early age is a very important time. Usually we're seeing 11, 12, 13-year-olds, not just for addiction, for mental illness. Things happen. And one thing we see in common is trauma that might happen. I can't tell you how many times, I don't have the numbers, but I can tell you anecdotally how many times we will work with people and see that when they were 11, 12, 13 years old, there was some type of very significant trauma, whether it was sexual abuse, verbal abuse, physical abuse, and at those ages where a person is so vulnerable that, and just to offer some hope here, it's not necessarily the abuse that does the damaging as much as it is, at times, the reaction to the abuse. So I have somebody in mind now. I'm just thinking they were inappropriately touched when they were 12 years old. Inappropriately touched is sexual abuse. And the person abused them was an adult, inappropriately touched this child, 12-year-old, and the child then reported to his father. His father came from a completely different culture, and when he heard this report, he got livid at the kid for saying such nonsense and hit the kid. That was the trauma, not the touch. To process that with a child in a healthy way, in a way where it allows a child to develop trust in a person, hopefully a parent, but with somebody, there's that trust. That's the most healing thing we hear time and again. And so how we're dealing with the trauma can sometimes be more important than actually the trauma itself. So things happen in people's lives that age. And also, we see with addiction that going from elementary school to high school, it's a major transition. Elementary school is usually much more localized. You're dealing in neighborhoods. You're walking to the schools, and you know the kids, the families. There's much more of a familiar setting, much more simple time in life, less of the peer pressure doesn't play the same. And then all of a sudden, a child in Montreal, they'll go to grade 7 to high school. And now they're in with a whole different type of crowds, not just crowds, and all types of factors come into play, and it's at the very worst time in a kid's life, 12, 13 years old, and now all of a sudden they have all the stressors that come with going into a big population or going into a population with lots of different actors and players, and so peer pressure, stress of that could become the trauma that will lead to addiction. Important to know, though, we're still talking about a smaller segment. We're not talking about everybody who has peer pressure, everybody who transitions, everybody who... No, we're talking about a percentage, whether it's 10 or 20%. And now what happens time and again, by the way, tying this together with mental illness, we hear so many times... I heard from a girl. She said recently that up until she was 12 years old, she doesn't remember breathing properly. She always remembered being in a sort of state of a panic almost. That's called anxiety disorder, right? So this is a kid walking around this world in a heightened state of anxiety. At 12 years old, somebody gave her a shot of hard alcohol. She took the shot down, and she says she remembers the feeling as it went down her throat. She remembers a certain soothing calmness come over her. First time she can remember that feeling. So now, think about that. How do we judge a person now like that? If I was in a state of panic, if that's all I knew was a certain heightened anxiety, and I then took something that automatically gave me a certain sense of soothing, I would be back there time and again, because that's all that counts. If I'm in a state of anxiety, I just need relief. And if this gives me relief, I'm going to do it time and again. And unfortunately, if there is a predisposition, if there are other factors, if there's family, if generational things, we have a lot of evidence now to show that addiction, there is a gene element, that we're isolating the genes, and we're seeing more and more about how the genetic factor plays a role in the predisposition for addiction, and of course for mental illness. That's where these things can come from. So we see a lot of anxiety disorders and self-medicating that could lead to addiction. And we also see addiction can lead to mental illness. Like I said before, there is such a thing as, we see it, I would probably think about 8% of the clients who come to us wanting to stop their marijuana abuse. And about 5 to 8% of those clients have had psychosis that were induced by the marijuana, which is not talked about enough, especially young people smoking with their friends. Their friends are socializing. Their friends are whatever their friends are getting out of it, they're getting out of it, and there's certainly what to get out of it, there's no question. And then there's that one kid, like I said before, who might be isolating, and then there's another kid there that could actually experience psychosis. I mean, I speak to guidance counselors all the time that something happened. A kid will come in reporting. One kid came in reporting to this guidance counselor that told me that the power lines were communicating with her, and talked about that, and it was clearly a girl who, and she traced it back to smoking the marijuana at the time. So, of course, we're not talking about anyone who smokes marijuana is going to have psychosis, but it does happen with marijuana at times, and something to see how substance abuse can trigger mental illness. But there really are two distinct diseases, and they need to be treated, each one, properly. The best is to be able to get help with a place that deals with both, and there is the school of thought that you can't work with somebody with mental illness until they've put down their drugs. We see that. As a matter of fact, we we do see that. We see that in therapy, and we're not talking about not just in therapy, but also therapeutically and to diagnose. We work with psychiatrists that will not see patients until they have 2 or 3 months sober, just because the brain, to be evaluated, needs to be evaluated in a place where it's not being it's not being in an altered state to be diagnosed. On the other hand, you have people who, because of the mental illness, whereas they're not going to get those few months sober, and then what do you do? So it's not so simple as to say they have to put it down before the diagnosis. There is truth in that, and then there's going to be situations where it's not so simple, and to have somebody who can properly diagnose and be able to work with that is crucial. We see misdiagnosis as probably one of the leading concerns, misdiagnosis. How many times have we heard very well-meaning, very well-educated professionals, but they don't have a background in addiction education, and so they're not understanding the importance of addressing that in and of itself. But I'll tell you some other things about mental illness and addiction. I can tell you personally. Personally, when I was 12, 13 years old, my brother was we didn't know it at the time. We just thought he was very, very wild and involved with all kinds of drugs and whatever it was. And it was only when he was actually in jail, and my parents were coached not to take the return phone calls from a jail out west in Edmonton. So my brother was out there. He was 18, 19, and he was calling from jail, and they were coached, don't take the calls, hold the boundary. And you can imagine and remember how hard that was. But because of my parents' courage, not only courage, but following instructions, because it took courage to follow the instructions, but they really needed the guidance. He bottomed in jail, and there was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and then was released to a psychiatric ward. He came back to Montreal, went to the psychiatric ward in the Jewish General Hospital, and with that diagnosis and with the proper treatment, he was able to stabilize and have a stable life, got married, and had children, and so what we thought was just wild drug use, was really a bipolar disorder that was off the walls, and you can see how could be confusion there. His manic states, where he was off the charts as far as he'll say anything to anyone. He was getting into fights constantly. He had a certain smugness about him that was almost, it was disconnected from reality in a certain sense. They just thought he was a bad kid doing a lot of drugs, but he was a sick kid, and it was, thank God, with the proper diagnosis that he was able to work things through. Now, this is I think something that I am so grateful for AMI-Quebec about, because I was that family member. So I was a 12-year-old, 13-year-old brother growing up in that home, and I saw how mental illness could, the confusion around it, the chaos, or the helplessness. That's a key thing. I saw the helplessness. And what my parents did, which is something that I give them tremendous amount of credit for, is we went to group counseling. We went to group to do family work. We named it. We spoke about it. We learned the difference between being helpless and getting help. We learned about the mental illness is the problem, not my brother. And we were able to move forward together as a family. So I can't emphasize how important it is to be involved with an organization like AMI-Quebec, who's leading the fight in Quebec in the English language services. There is nobody else doing what AMI-Quebec is doing, but empowering the family, guiding the family, helping the family to understand. There's 12-year-olds all over who need to have this kind of conversation because it's their older brother, older sisters. And we meet in Chabad Lifeline so many addicts who tell us that their parents could have been suffering from different type of mental disorders, and they developed skills where they were parenting their parents. And then the burden became so great they needed to find relief. And that's where the substance abuse or the behavioral abuse, people confuse a lot of times, and I deal with clergy at times, trying to educate clergy. So clergy can look at behaviors with a certain moral judgment, which I understand its place, and I'm not here to speak to that. What I am here to open up the dialogue and say that so many times kids, young adults are doing certain behaviors not because the behaviors are enticing because of the lure or the temptation of whatever it is, whether it's sex addiction, internet pornography, gambling, whatever. It's physical relief. There's a release that they're experiencing from what I said before, is that unbearable feeling of either isolation, anxiety, whatever it is. So I'm trying to work with clergy from all faiths to be able to help them understand this is not necessarily, of course it's a spiritual dilemma, but we have to look at it as a physical ailment as well, and to be able to help those coming to us with these issues, help them learn mindfulness, learn breathing techniques, learn the importance of exercise, eating proper. There's nothing like sleep. Sleep deprivation is torture in certain countries, right? So sleep there's an expression in 12 steps called H.A.L.T. If a person's ever feeling triggered, feeling anxiety or angst, then you ask yourself 4 questions. We call it H.A.L.T. H-A-L-T. H.A.L.T. So H would be, am I hungry? If I am, have something to eat. Angry is the A. Lonely is the L. And T, tired. So here a person can be experiencing a real angst, like a philosophical dilemma that's gonna, their whole world's upside down, something big, and they stop and they think, wait a second, did I eat lunch? Do I need a nap? Do I need a 15-minute, or do I just, you know what I just did before I came here? I have an app where there's guided meditation, and I just close my eyes and listen to this app for 15 minutes just to get grounded, to get my breathing in sync, and to be able to go into the world in a much more grounded way. So that halt, it could be crucial. And that's where, when we're talking to clergy or talking to anybody else, talk to you, talk to myself, to have that way of checking myself and checking in with others, to ask those 4 simple questions. Now, it's a lot easier to eat something if I'm hungry, or take a nap if I'm tired. But if I'm lonely or if I'm angry, so that's where the process is so important, that what we subscribe to, and we believe very, very strongly, and not just believe in it, we have statistics to prove it from our own experience, how the 12-step philosophy not only saves lives, but manages lives. So many people, in the thousands. We said we have 16,000 visitors a year. So I've been there 10 years. So you do the math. How many times people will come in, and they might have been in therapy for years dealing with their addictions. And the therapist never said to them, have you checked out this 12-step fellowship, whether it's Alcoholics Anonymous, whether it's Al-Anon for Partners of, whether it's Sexaholics Anonymous, Cocaine Anonymous, well, and there's a whole gamut. You can Google any of the AA offshoots. They all came from AA in the 1930s. And the 12 steps, I encourage anyone there to check out the 12 steps as just a way of life, because it's really about connecting with yourself, with others, and with a higher power, which is what brings about such healing. So what we see is people going to therapists working, whether it's cognitive behavioral therapy, whether it's analysis, any Gestalt, any of these type of methods working with clients, and they're not being introduced to 12 steps. And once they are, that's where there's rapid changes. And sometimes the talk therapy is not what's needed, or certainly not the only thing needed. So what we see in the 12 steps is that behavior can change thinking many times a lot easier or a lot quicker than thinking will change behavior. Act as if, bring the body, take the actions. And of course, if I'm guided in that way, that's a major step. But to go there then takes a certain willingness that sometimes that alone is a prayer, is help me have the willingness to take the next right move. And if I don't have the willingness, I can say, please help me have the willingness to have the willingness. Whatever I got to do to get that next right step in for my day is crucial to act into healing rather than think into healing. So we see that with the 12 steps. So we see how mindfulness is a major part of the 12 steps. Action. We see, by the way, certain things. The number one killer of alcoholics, you would think, is alcohol. We see the number one killer of alcoholics is resentment. Resentment breeds. It's poisonous. It's a poison that not just an addict, but resentment in general robs a person of being present, robs a person of being connected. Because resentment is all about I'm going to disconnect from you because of what you did to me. And so we see there's a process of how to work through resentments. That's the fourth step. I mean, I can go through each one of the steps here and show how it's beneficial, not just for the addict. I would say for anybody, including mental illness. I would say anybody in general. This is a philosophy, a way of life that is so healing, and I would encourage anybody to check that out. When it comes to mental illness, we will, at Chabad Lifeline, if there's a dual diagnosis, we will only work with the person who's coming in with mental illness as long as, and it depends on what, but if it's a psychiatric disorder, we want to have a psychiatrist who's going to be overseeing the client. So important is the medication. So important, and that's not something we are able to give. So to have that as a resource is part of the protocol that we want. And also, it depends on the functioning. It depends on the psychosis versus neurosis. Depends on we're talking about somebody with anxiety disorder or somebody with schizophrenia that's not being treated. So we're not working with people who are coming to us with psychosis in this sense. That's not what we have the capability to do. We're dealing with higher functioning people who, experiencing depression, experiencing other types of mental illness, and as long as they have a psychiatrist who's helping them with medication, then we see wonders with the work we do, especially with 12 steps. The fellowship and the camaraderie, the connections, like I said, that people can find within 12-step workshops, 12-step meetings, works wonders for people. For instance, there are cases of, I've talked to psychiatrists who were amazed because they saw how a person who wasn't taking to different kinds of treatments was enamored and taken. They saw real changes in real time with people who simply began the process of healing with others of people who share experiences, feelings, especially experiencing feelings, and naming the feelings. Someone mentioned to me that they went for 8 months to actually this person in Sexaholics Anonymous, SA it's called. He went to SA for 8 months, I think 2 or 3 times a week, where they would talk about isolation. Every now and then it was like a theme that they would address. And it took him 8 months to realize, because the whole time he was thinking he doesn't really relate to that. Until he realized all he is living in isolation. But he needed it to be named, to describe. It took him time to see it. And then just that seeing it alone is that's a relief that he was describing to me. And then to talk it through with other people who have been there and are working through it together is so helpful. So, and the spiritual angle, I think the spiritual angle, I'm not talking about the religious, because although Chabad Lifeline is run by the Chabad movement, which is an international organization, that it's a social welfare and it's a religious organization serving the Jewish community worldwide. But within that international organization, there exists certain offices around the world that are dealing exclusively with whether it's children with special needs, food kitchen, or in our case, addiction. So we're treating everybody, Jews and non-Jews alike. We look at this as a disorder that's applicable to everybody, and therefore we have an obligation as a Jewish organization, as Jews, we have an obligation to try to be a light unto the nations, which means alleviating suffering in any way, shape, or form. But we do not mix religion. We have clinically sound practices. We have therapists, and we don't bring religion into any of this. It's very important, and I try to emphasize that too with clergy. As a matter of fact, there's a Baptist Bible college in Pennsylvania. They come once a year to us for the day. They come for a week every year to Montreal, and they come to us for a day to do training with addiction. And one of the things I try to get to them is that here you're talking, I'm a bearded rabbi from a Hasidic Chabad tradition, and I'm telling you, don't mix religion in with your clinical practice. Spirituality, one thing, not religion. That's just where we're coming from. What's the difference? That's a whole discussion on its own. But the spirituality that I'm talking about is one where non-judgmental, mindfulness, unity being so important, growth, hope, and there is a purpose, and everybody was created for a purpose, and nobody's a accident, and believing that there is a higher power, not necessarily defining that higher power, but that there is something bigger and greater than the individual, and how we are all ultimately connected. And I guess maybe I can conclude that spiritual part about how we are all connected with ourselves, with each other, with a higher power. That's when there's a distortion in that. And that's not by our doing, by the way. That's our higher power's doing. Our higher power hides, so to speak. And then there becomes this vacuum. And then we who know down very deep that we are all connected, we start to feel disconnected, and that's the trauma of traumas. So it's the spiritual solution involves addressing that deep knowing that in fact we are connected, that in fact everybody counts. And by connecting to that spiritual truth that lies deep within each of us, we're kind of restoring a person to a certain sanity, a certain knowing that so much of the time, so many of the voices, so many of the messages we give ourselves is that we are not important. We do not count. We are not connected. A person comes into the room thinking either I am better than everybody here or I am worse than everybody here, but never that I am one with everybody here. So that's where the spiritual part comes in, and that's where we see that works. So I'm going to open it up for questions in just a moment. I just want to let you know that you can follow us on Facebook. We put a lot of time into our Chabad Lifeline Facebook page. please go in there and like us and our website, chabadlifeline.com. And now, anybody who has any questions.
You mentioned all types of addiction, but it really something kind of on the kind of cutting edge the last few years that you really didn't get to mention is cyber addiction in general. What can you speak briefly about things you've seen with just people addicted to being on their computers and their phones? Can you talk a bit about that?
I can say that the level of stress and anxiety, and coming back to the feeling of disconnect, you might think that if a person is involved in social media, then they're being social and they're interacting. But what studies have shown and what our own experience is that no, it's more isolating than anything else, and the stress that comes with that isolation. So that's with the social media. So like anything, moderation. But if you're dealing with addiction and mental illness, moderation is not a word to throw in here. But certainly getting guidance and regulating it in a way, accountability with that's a very crucial thing for social media. And in general, there was a researcher named Patrick Carnes in the early 90s, just when the internet was coming onto the scene. He said a tsunami is coming. And what he meant was internet pornography. And if that was the tsunami was coming, right now the wave is I don't know if it's taking us out to sea yet, but it's certainly overwhelming us. And the amount of the industry, internet pornography industry, which by the way Montreal has one of the main websites here, and it's somewhere around, when I heard this statistic, it was, 5-8 years ago, so it's much more by now, but it was $43 billion annual industry. And what's happening is younger people are seeing more today than we, people in my age, I'm 52, will have seen in our lifetime. So a 10-year-old now, 11-year-old now, is not, without having to look for anything, it's coming to them. I actually had a conversation with a psychologist. I was completely shocked, and on the other hand, I wasn't, because it's business. But the psychologist was saying how they left a job which was to work for this internet pornography company on how to get to the younger audience's brains quicker. So this is a science, and it's. I tell parents all the time that unless you're willing to have your kid have a door in their room that you have no control over, you don't know who comes in, who goes out, you have no idea who's coming in and out of the kid's room, don't think that their internet in their room is any different. As a matter of fact, it's much worse. It could be. And I would say it usually is. That's where filtering comes in. That's where knowing your kids, where they're at, what websites, history checking. But kids know more about technology than any parent, so that's not a foolproof thing whatsoever. But I've been told by adults, 30-year-olds, that they would have loved for their parents to be more involved in monitoring what they were doing on the internet than less. I mean, that seems to be a common theme, is people with addictions will come and say they just wish there was tougher rules. They wish there was more guidance, more monitoring, more accountability. Actually, this talks a certain sense to what we talked about, codependency. We just briefly talked about codependency. One of the common symptoms amongst codependents is not wanting to rock the boat at any cost. So parents, well-meaning parents, I can speak for myself, a mother who most important was everyone should be happy at any cost, including letting me do whatever I wanted. And so looking back now, and wanting to talk to parents about this, rules, boundaries, with love and understanding it's from love. And the kids might not necessarily accept that it's coming from love, but eventually I think they will. So that's internet pornography. It's a huge issue, not just amongst kids, but amongst adults. We see probably about 20% of the traffic that comes through Chabad Lifeline are people who are a sex addict. And of the sex addicts, probably 80% have to do with internet pornography, and so that's a topic all its own. And the amount of trauma that's being portrayed as fun, the amount of reenactment of trauma, mental abuse that we see with pornography and with other things is just a shocking part of our reality that we need to be aware of and to deal with.
What are basically all the main services that you offer to anyone here in Montreal?
So we have, for anybody dealing with addiction, so and the addict himself, herself, we have frontline treatment, intake screenings, treatment plans. We have referral services. We actually have many 12-step meetings in our premises. We also have group therapy. We a lot of times people with addiction might be on their way into a rehab, government-sponsored rehab, and there's a waiting list. So we can help a person get through that waiting period, and we can also offer the aftercare once they leave the rehab. Our experience is probably more than 75% of the addicts that we're dealing with will not need inpatient. But if they do, then we can help that process, and that's one thing. And then the family members of addicts. So we have family groups that are run weekly, and we have a family counselor. So my wife, who, when I was pursuing this interest in working with addiction as a pastoral counselor close to 30 years ago, my wife wanted to be there for the wives and the family members of the addicts that I was working with. So she went back to school and she got a master's in social work, and she's trained extensively with somebody named Melody and other pioneers in the codependency field. So she runs a family department, so family members coming in. We also we have a sex addiction therapist, and many times the sex addiction therapist will meet with the sex addict, and the partner will meet with my wife. You can imagine the partners are usually devastated with news, people being married 20, 30, 40 years, and all of a sudden they find out that their husband or their wife is doing things, has been doing things for years, and now it's come out. So my wife is the family counselor, and she'll be working with a partner. And many times the four of them will get together, and so our goal is to work towards healing in the family. We also have youth services, so we have 3 youth counselors. My passion is for what we call the innocent victim, which I think AMI-Quebec is famous for. I know AMI-Quebec coined the phrase hidden victim. That speaks volumes. There are children, there are family members who are, in a certain sense, innocent victims of the train wreck of addiction, or in AMI-Quebec's mandate, mental illness. And so the family members, so the children especially. So we have a youth department that deals with this population. In-house, we also have an extensive outreach to schools. We have youth counselors who we hire and who's with us for 6 hours or 8 hours a week, and is at 5 alternative schools, the rest of the time being a youth counselor in the schools. And we also have a school suspension program with the schools, so kids who are being flagged for being caught with drugs or whatever it is, they will come to us and we'll do a intake, a screening, and so we do a lot with the children as well. So
I'm going to wrap up here. So I wanted to thank Rabbi Benyamin Bresinger. And once again, his website is www.chabadlifeline.com. We'll put his contact info below when we post this on our Soundcloud account. Once again, AMI-Quebec, we offer podcasts, videos, support groups, counseling, workshops, and a whole lot more. Mainly, like Rabbi said, our mandate is for the caregivers of those with mental illness. You can reach AMI-Quebec at toll-free at 877-303-0220. 0264, or you can reach us anytime on our website, www.AMI-Quebec.org. Once again, I wanted to thank Rabbi Bresinger for being with us tonight, and thank you all for attending. Good night.